Okay, we are going to show an alternate way that you can print your block. Instead of just using full strength pressure as you're burnishing, we're going to do a kiss print. This allows us to get a little bit more depth in the image and allows us to draw more attention to certain areas of the cutting and the line work than other areas. So things that you'll need your standard printmaking ink. You'll also need to have inked up your block. So I've already gone ahead and inked to save a little bit of time. So this is ready to print. I'm going to position the block in my printing jig. And for kiss printing, you really need a paper that is somewhat transparent so that you can see through as you're burnishing. So I'll be using a sheet of mulberry paper. This is a washi paper, which is a Japanese, very strong but very thin, kind of delicate paper. It's hard to see it with the camera, but there's a very subtle linear pattern on the paper that shows that it was made by hand. So it's a really beautiful paper. I've torn the paper rather than cut it because I kind of like that deckled edge. And I also did not hole punch this one. I'm just going to tape it on. I'm going to try to center it approximately and try to keep it fairly square. But then once it's down on the block, I'm going to just tape it on there, and then I can peek at the progress and put it back in the same spot. I'm noticing that one side of the paper is slightly smoother than the other, and I like to have the smooth side down, so I'm flipping the paper over. And then once it touches the block, you just need to kind of let it be. So even if it looks a little crooked, it's better to not move it around because it will double print. So I'm using artist tape. You want to make sure you choose a tape that is removable and that won't rip too much the fibers off the paper. So I'm not using a lot of pressure as I tack it down, just enough to kind of hold it into position. So I do want to have some depth in the clouds. I'm going to not press all the clouds equally dark, but I do want the balloon shape itself to be very distinct. So I want to be careful here since the balloon edges against the clouds. I'm trying to hit only the balloon and not everything behind it. The other thing I'm being careful about is not pressing down like I normally would with my fingers to hold the paper into position, because that also can leave fingerprints on your image that where you don't want them. So if you must hold the paper down, try to hold it in a spot that you intend to burnish later so that if it ends up darker, it won't mess up your image. So I want the strings of the balloon to be printing dark. And here's a spot where you might even use the other end of your wooden spoon so that you have a little more control over exactly where you're pressing on the block. So there's little people in this hot air balloon. You want to make sure that they are nice and dark as well. And then I'd like the basket to stand out clearly. There's a little bag of sand here too. I'm trying to burnish. Okay, I've got 3 bags of sand. And I'm just using the edge of the spoon here. So I'm using light pressure. I don't want to press so hard that the ink oozes through the paper and I start smearing it around. If you see that starting to happen, you may have over inked your plate. And really about the only thing you can do is put a piece of wax paper or something underneath your spoon so that you don't make the problem worse as you're burnishing. All right, so again, you can peek as you go. Just don't let the paper come off the pin. So you can see that it's a little bit darker in the balloon than it is in the trees. Now I'm trying to get a few different layers of depth. So I want the most distant mountains to have a very light pressing, so it just almost becomes a half tone. And then I'll press a little bit harder, maybe again, just with my finger, I think, on this mountain, because I want it a little bit darker than the distant hill, but not as dark as the trees in the foreground. So I'm just being slow and methodical here. And see how that's working. Okay, they're slightly bit darker. And then I'm going to press really hard on this little tree that's in the front. So again, I want to be kind of careful not to just extend across the contours of that shape and hit the mountain. I just want to try to only burnish the tree. Here you have to be careful because there's part of the hill right beside it at this point. You could use the end of a ballpoint pen, the end with a lid, if you want a little more control there. And there's a second tree here I'm going to try to bring out. You can even use your burnishing spoon as a drawing tool. If you've got a large area of the plate that is inking black, you can draw through there so that you get more texture than you normally would if you just had printed it full pressure. All right, and I think I will, I'm trying to distinguish this foreground hill from the back one, so I'm going to do a little bit of kind of drawing onto the, bring that out a little bit more, see how that works. And there's another little bush here I didn't notice. So we'll press pretty hard on that one as well, so it really pops out. All right, well, I think we're about done. I'm gonna bring one of these clouds. So typically with clouds, they kind of work in the opposite order that land elements do. So with grounds, you know, things that are lower on your page are going to be the darker things because they tend to be closer. But with clouds, the clouds that are lower are actually the ones that are further away. So as the clouds get further up in my composition, I'm going to press a little bit harder. So I'll add the most pressure on this one that's closest to the top. So that it stands out a little more clearly than the ones that are farther away. Okay, let's take a peek. All right, I'll take that off and show it to you in comparison to the one that we printed full pressure. Let me just pull this out of the way. So the first one we printed was this one, and then the one we just printed. And really the place where we see the most difference is in the foreground here. So put it in my ink. But, hold it up a little bit higher. So anyway, this one is the kiss printed one. This one is the printed full value. And you can see how this one does have a little bit more effective atmospheric perspective in the hills and a little bit in the clouds. It's not as noticeable in the clouds, but I think it helps a little bit.